Hey folks, you're listening to episode 20 of the Deeply Devoted podcast, a ministry of the E-Free Church of Bemidji, Minnesota. My name is Eric Niger, and I'm one of the pastors on staff here at E-Free Bemidji. And today on the podcast, we are beginning our podcast read-along. And we're going to get started with the book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And to really help us get started, my guest today in the Deeply Devoted podcast studio is Adam Bommersbach, and we're going to discuss book one. It's kind of confusing. So book one of the book, Mere Christianity, it's called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And really, as we get into this, I hope that Adam and I will talk about it, but I hope that listeners will also engage. And so just a reminder, we do have an email address, podcast@efcbemidji.org, and would love to just hear what other people think about this section of the book, your questions, your comments, the things you liked, the things you didn't understand, the things you didn't agree with. And so we don't really know where this is going to go, and it'll help to shape future episodes. But I'm ready to get into it. So, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
When I thought about this idea, and I knew it was kind of an apologetics-y theme, I thought to myself, there's two people in our church that I would pick. One is Taylor Borders, and I already talked to him about choir, and I thought, Adam's the other guy. Adam is the other natural fit here. So, Adam, are you really ready to help me unpack, as this is called, the meaning of the universe?
Well, the universe might be a bit of a stretch, but if we can get to maybe even a little bit of, meaning of meaning, or what is the meaning of meaning, that'll be a good place for us to start with this.
Yeah, and we'll see. Let's see. We both kind of like to talk about these theological, philosophical ideas. Adam and I have been in life groups together, and sometimes our discussions have tangented a little more into the philosophical. So we'll try to keep it at a reasonable level here. But before we get in deep to Mere Christianity and apologetics and philosophy and all that kind of good stuff, we should get to know you a little bit, Adam. Would you mind just kind of telling us a little bit about yourself, how long you've been a part of our church family, and what maybe brought you here?
Sure. So about myself, I've been in the Bemidji community since 2013. That was when my wife and I got married. I moved here for work in May, and then she followed me here that following July. And since that time, we've had our three kids. I've got three kids there: Ainsley, who's 8, Afa, who's 5, and Arwen, who's 3. And I guess depending on how far back you wanted to go with faith journey and stuff, I was raised in a home as kind of a nun, and so not nun as in habit-wearing nun, but the term
not N-U-N,
nun,
but N-O-N-E.
N-O-N-E, yeah. My dad's side of the family came from a Catholic background, and then my mom's side of the family from kind of a small Lutheran denomination. And it just worked out where, in our home, it wasn't hostile to faith, but just wasn't part of the family unit. So I grew up kind of that, and it's even to think about, only 20 years ago or so, I grew up as kind of the odd one in my class at school, as the one who didn't go to church on Sundays and didn't go to the youth group on Wednesday night. And so just kind of had that background, and kind of floated in that space until 2006-ish, when the God delusion dropped, from, I think it was Richard Dawkins was the author of that, in the era of when a kid thinks he already knows everything there is to know. Mm-hmm. And then you have, kind of some of these individuals coming out, the new atheists of that era, kind of having some of, sounding like the most intelligent person in the room, mm-hmm. with really cool British accents. And so it was really kind of, an attractive thing. And that's kind of the first time where I ever really actually thought about it. I didn't necessarily go down the atheist pathway.
Okay.
But it was kind of an early spark of something that, got me thinking about God, theology in general.
Start asking some of those questions.
Some of those questions. Yeah. And so, carried on to my early college years in that kind of agnostic space, but reading the philosophers, reading some of the old religious texts. And then for me, surprisingly enough, and it'll, kind of line up with the apologetics, I wouldn't have called it the fine-tuning argument for the existing of the universe at that time. I didn't have that language available to me. But I'm a 3 degrees in the sciences for my education. So I have a biology degree, a chemistry degree, and a health science degree.
Okay.
And so I'm sitting in these genetics courses, and I'm sitting in some of these other sciences, and it just kind of become this overwhelming feeling to me that, this all exists in this space by random chance. And so then that really pressed me in the direction of starting to take, some of the religious texts and the theology and realizing that there was actually good arguments for God's existence, not just the schmarmy Brits. So when you asked me about Mere Christianity, it was kind of funny to me because it's actually one of the first early books that I read through then, in those middle college years.
Okay. From a Christian worldview perspective? Or?
And moving towards the Christian worldview perspective, in that 21, 22 years old range.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of interesting. I don't know how much we'll get into it, but, when you think about who C.S. Lewis was, what a similar kind of story. He was...
he was about 33 when he made that transition.
But still, a thinker, would have probably, I don't know if he would have described himself as an atheist or what he would have, but certainly he wasn't a very religious person, he would not have called himself a Christian. And it was in the investigating, my understanding, that led him toward thinking more, not just investigating Christianity, but drew him to Christ, to faith in Christ.
And that's when you reached out to me, it was actually something that, like I say, kind of touched me a little bit too, because it C.S. Lewis is significantly more intelligent than I am, but it is a path that we kind of did share. Kind of similar touch points with.
Right. And it's always kind of interesting. There's others out there, some famous, some less famous, but have similar kind of stories of, started at a point of either, more of that agnostic view or even more atheistic view, and then just what the Lord used to draw them in. So kind of cool. So this will be interesting to get into. So I did not find my original copy of Mere Christianity. I have a copy somewhere. It's underlined and highlighted because I've read it a couple of times. I can't find it. So I picked up the new copy that we made available for folks at our church here. And I'm thinking about it, this book here, if you were to go to the library and you were to look for it, or you go to the bookstore and you look for it, we would probably, depending on how they shelve things, find it in the apologetics section. We've already kind of mentioned that word apologetics. Mm-hmm. I think it would be helpful, Adam, if you would just can you define that term for us? Give us an idea of what are we talking about when we're talking about apologetics?
Sure. And so at its simplest, apologetics is just a defense of the faith. Now, certainly it gets more complicated than that because there's different ways that different people or different areas that people are going to do apologetics in.
Right.
And so Mere Christianity, you're looking at clearly Christian apologetics, but it's starting at that, as we talk about here in book 1, you're starting at that very beginning of just even defending why God is rational.
Yeah.
And then, there's other areas of apologetics, because you have, some of the like almost interfamily apologetics where you've got, the Calvinist who will defend their position versus the Arminian, and you've got, both of them who will defend their position against the Molinist, or, at larger scale, you've got, us as Protestants and some of our differences that we defend against perhaps, say the Catholic faith.
Right.
And these kind of, and all of that fits under the heading of apologetics. But apologetics is really just that being able to use fact, the mind, to give a coherent defense of the faith.
Yeah.
And that's different too, because some people try to blend or use intertwined like evangelism, and while they're similar, they're not the same. Evangelism is the proclamation of the gospel, and people have differences of opinion. The most effective way of doing that too,
right?
So they're similar, but sometimes we get those terms confused.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because you can use apologetics as a tool, let's say, to help point a non-believer to rational reasons for why our faith is worth believing. Mm-hmm. But you can also, I guess you could say it this way, take apologetics and you could use it as a tool to encourage believers and say, there are some good reasons for believing what we believe. At the end of the day, we talk about faith, and we believe these things by faith, and so we're not necessarily proving the existence of God or the reliability of the New Testament or the resurrection of Jesus, but we're giving evidence for these things. Is it reasonable to believe, say, for example, Jesus rose from the dead, and on what basis? So, yeah, I think that's helpful. And so, yes, we could probably go really, really deep in the philosophical realm, but in one sense, everybody does apologetics, because they're thinking, is what I believe, am I purely blindly believing this, or is there a reason to believe these things? So,
well, and you're actually called to do that, to be able to stand and give a defense of your faith.
Yes, yeah, that's a biblical concept. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So let's start talking about C.S. Lewis here. He was a philosopher and a theologian. Interesting. I think a lot of folks know this if they know who C.S. Lewis is. He had a real interest in myth and storytelling. He wrote, I don't even know how many books he wrote over the years, but a lot.
A lot.
Fiction and nonfiction. Adam, have you read, beyond mere Christianity, have you read much of Lewis, and do you have any other favorites?
Yeah, so I've read a fair amount of works by C.S. Lewis,
Mm-hmm.
and I have children, so we've, dabbled into the Chronicles of Narnia already, and some of these kind of things. And, for me, C.S. Lewis was, first and foremost, he's a literary scholar. And I think that's what, to me impresses me about Lewis, or why I'm drawn to Lewis, is actually that literary scholar. He definitely has a deep understanding of philosophy. Mm-hmm. And he definitely, has a deep understanding of theology. But also you see in his works that gets better over time, as well as he develops into understanding the faith.
Yes.
And his faith.
Yeah.
And so some of those get stronger, and you see that Chronicles of Narnia, the allegory is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
The lion who is sacrificed and resurrected,
Right.
And then you get farther on in his works, probably one of my favorite of his is actually one of the last novels that he had written, and that was Till We Have Faces.
Okay, part of the Space Trilogy. Or no, that wasn't part of the Space Trilogy.
No, not part of the Space Trilogy. But no, the Till We Have Faces is retelling of the Greek legend of Cupid and Psyche.
That's okay.
And really, by then, you can see Lewis's understanding of this supernatural need for grace in our redemption.
Yeah.
And so, like I say, for me, that's one of my favorites of his. But I've read a lot of them. Abolition of Man is another one that's good. Space Trilogy, although I have to be honest, I've struggled reading.
They're kind of weird.
Yeah, I've struggled reading.
I mean,
Space
you have
Trilogy.
to really like. I don't even. It's science fiction, but it's weird.
It's different.
Yeah,
and so like
it's not my favorite.
yeah, and so there are definitely other novelists who maybe if I'm going to just sit down, for the purpose of that, I lean a little bit more to. But no, definitely covered a fair amount of his. But as you mentioned in your intro too, I think, or sometime earlier here, being in Life Group, and just a plug for Life Group.
Yeah.
So anybody who's, unfortunately been with me in a life group as I'm expounding on the importance of story and all of the stories and how stories provide us a structure of understanding to bring in some of these bigger concepts.
Yeah.
That's where, to me, C.S. Lewis having that literary background and the deep ability to tell story in a way that can bring people roundabout to a conclusion without necessarily beating you on the head with it.
Right.
Is really masterful.
Yeah. The ability to tell a good story, not just for the sake of entertainment, but to leave you thinking. Yeah. Which I think is so masterful in his Chronicles of Narnia, because it's written for children, and those, and you're right, those allegorical pictures are pretty right there on the surface, but I love reading those. I never get tired of that. I think my favorite in that series is The Magician's Nephew. I've always liked that one. Of course, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a classic. But I think one of the other first books I read by Lewis that really had an impact on me was his book on miracles. And I don't know why that one stood out to me so much, but I've gone back to that again and again and again, and just such a great thinker. And he does get a little heady sometimes, even in the book we're reading here. Gets a little heady. I found myself as I reread, okay, I need to read that paragraph again and really chew on that. And what is he saying and things like that. So, but, that kind of leads to this question of, look, there's thousands of Christian books out there. Some of them are good. Some of them are not so good. But, Mere Christianity is one that I think we could fairly label as a Christian classic, that people are still reading it long after C.S. Lewis is gone. Adam, why do you think it's become a classic?
Well, as heady as it can get at times, I also think it's kind of a easy entry point, because where Lewis is defending mere Christianity. So first and foremost, his target is fairly narrow.
Yep.
And then stylistically, the book comes about as a result of transcribing talks that he gave on the radio.
Right.
And so when you're having a conversation, such as you and I are here, sometimes the way that information flows can get a little heady, or a little as you're thinking through the things that you're trying to say or what you're going to say next. And so maybe it carries on a little longer than what you originally intended.
Right.
And you kind of got to navigate your way back. But it provides this kind of relaxed, easy, straightforward, conversational tone that I think in an area, sometimes if you're not a Christian coming to it, and picking this up, it's not overwhelming.
Yeah.
It doesn't get lost in some of the Christian terminology. It's just it's extremely approachable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think he brings that out, that he's very intentional about that. It does make me think, this did start as a radio broadcast. Makes me think, if Lewis were alive today, would he be podcasting Mere Christianity, or, what would be the medium he would use today to communicate? But in the preface of this book, and this is really kind of where this title really comes from, he says, For I am not writing to expound something I would call my religion, but to expound mere Christianity, which is what it is and what it was long before I was born, and whether I like it or not. Now, that's one of those statements I probably had to read and reread, and okay, what is he trying to say there? What do you think he meant by mere Christianity? What is this title suggesting?
Well, there's a couple of thoughts that I had, too, when I was reading through it. And one takeaway from that particular, what you just read, is that Christianity is what it is, as it always has been, regardless of my personal take on it.
Right.
Christianity is Christianity.
There is a Christianity.
There is a Christianity.
Not Adam's version, my version. Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
Once and always will be.
Right.
But then in addition, he'll go on, later in the book, as hopefully people are reading through it, you'll see him make this reference to Christianity as a house. And what he's trying to do is get you through the front door. Mm-hmm. And once you get through that front door, you're going to find a hallway. And down the hallway, there are additional doors that you are going to have to investigate yourself and find which room in the home you are comfortable with being. But all of these rooms are still in the same house.
Yeah.
And so this is bringing you back to that. There is one Christianity. Perhaps there are further investigations that you have to do, but this is where we're going to get you through that front door of the home and into that hallway.
Okay. Yeah. So it is an introductory point, and it's not a very big book, and so it's not going to be comprehensive of everything you need to know about Christianity. But yeah, I like that picture. Enough to get you in the door. We'll say that. So, and just to go back a little bit here to apologetics. You think about all the different ways that theologians have reasoned for the existence of God. And this is, I was a philosophy major in college, and I remember my introduction to it in Philosophy 101. I was surprised to learn just how much of, at least one segment of Western philosophy is all about the existence of God. And not even from a religious necessarily point of view or a Christian point of view, just that's sort of the start of discovering how do we know what we know and how can we know it, those kinds of things. Anyway, so there's all of these different arguments for the existence of God. Lewis kind of takes his approach. Adam, how would you describe what he's doing in this first part of the book?
Yeah, Lewis's approach is his version, and this is where it comes to how he articulates and illustrates it. It's his way of trying to get the listener or the reader or the to follow along with what would be called an argument from morality.
Okay, right.
That's, again, he's not necessarily using the argument from morality term in the book, but that's the case that he's trying to lay out and kind of walk you towards. Right. The most simplest version of that is, premise 1, objective moral values exist. Premise 2, God is the best explanation for why these moral values exist.
Yeah.
Therefore, conclusion, God exists. Now, he's going to use a lot more words,
right,
and in his own style and way to try and bring the reader along to that. But that's fundamentally what he's trying to do.
Yeah. And that's not unique to Lewis. Philosophers, theologians, apologists have been doing this for centuries as sort of one tactic for to argue for or make a case for.
And I think Lewis too, you talked about there's some of like the prologues and stuff in this book. This is following these chats on air are following major war and conflict in the world.
Yes.
And so it's in a particular time and setting with particular events fresh on people's minds.
Right.
And, we're not going to talk about just war theory today, but this is things that people would have been thinking about and going through.
Right.
And so, and actually it's one of those where it's, when you look at apologetics, it's not one that has seemingly been used a lot. It's out there and it's existed and it's existed for a long time. But a lot of people didn't spend it's coming back into the argument for morality is actually what I would say coming back into vogue here with a lot of modern apologists kind of coming back to it again as maybe our world and culture and we've had a crisis of meaning and some of this kind of comes back around, which is kind of what makes Lewis evergreen too.
Yeah. And why people are still thinking along these lines, asking these questions, reading this book. And hopefully as we go through this, maybe that's one of our takeaways for reading this book is, maybe we're not going to lay out the case like Lewis would, but perhaps in a conversation with a friend, that's really struggling with, evil in the world, and how do I explain it? And, maybe they're not wrestling with the existence of God, but, how do we know what is right? How do we know what is wrong? Where does that come from? These are real world conversations. These are not just philosophers' conversations to kind of entertain ourselves. Yeah.
Well, and that's where Lewis does a good job as he's working his way through that, because he's talking about even if you and I disagree about where that moral line exists, we're still talking about a moral line that exists.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there is a moral line that we can debate means we already accept that there is one that can exist, that we can make moral judgments.
Right. It's moving us in that direction. And this is really interesting. So I thought this was a good way to say this. End of the first chapter, he says, if we do not believe in decent behavior, why should we be so anxious to make excuses for not having behaved decently? And again, what's he saying there? My take on that is, in a nutshell, he's arguing, one, just as you said, we all have an innate sense of right and wrong. And two, he makes this point, and we're just not very good at even obeying our own moral standards. And what it seems to be he's saying is, I can get mad at you for doing the wrong thing, but it won't be long before I do that very same wrong thing. But I'm going to say, but there was a good reason for why I lied or why I cheated or why I stole or whatever, fill in the blank kind of there. And so I wonder, first of all, Adam, how do you think people today would respond to Lewis and that idea there?
Well, probably not well, as evidenced by what we talked about here a little bit with current. As a culture, we've really shifted in this. You can't judge me,
right?
And so trying to have that conversation of, where that moral line is when people can have their own truth.
Yeah.
Well, this is my truth. That really gets muddy.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I think he makes, kind of a smart chess move when he's talking about, well, even if your truth, you still believe that your actions are better than my actions.
Right.
You're making a moral judgment. It might be different than mine.
Right.
But you're still making a moral judgment.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of it. I've probably spent too much time online in some of these chat forums, trying to make some of these conversations with people, because that's kind of the pattern that you get. You know?
Right.
Who are you to be the arbiter of what morality is?
Right.
You know, and then trying to move back this direction with that and have that conversation. But I wasn't around at Lewis's time, but my assumption is it was probably received similarly in that time as well.
Seems pretty natural. And what's interesting, in this really early stage of his argument, I don't even think he's necessarily assigning blame.
No, not at all.
All he's saying is we have a gut instinct. And even based on our own gut instinct, sometimes we don't even keep our own standard. And it made me think a little bit about, and he doesn't quote any scripture here or anything like that.
Nope.
He's not even close to getting into thus says the Lord or anything like that. But it made me think of what the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 1. Romans 1, 18 to 23. And I'm kind of curious. I see you've got a Bible there, Adam. I don't know. Would you be willing maybe to just even read those verses? And I don't know. I'm kind of showing my hand here, but do you think this is related?
Yeah, and that's I was going to go ahead and just kind of read this so that the listener could kind of follow along too if they didn't happen to have a Bible in their hand.
Yeah, please do.
I often listen to these things as I'm driving around in the car. So that's Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And yes, you're right. Lewis isn't pulling any scripture, but here too, Paul, being the apostle to the Gentiles, he's going out into a world. I think maybe the one advantage of people at that time is, they might not have been Christians, but even as pagans, they probably, accept the existence of God, some kind of God,
divine,
or some kind of there is a mover of some kind, misappropriated, misplaced, but they're more open to that than maybe some of the atheists of today who are humanistic and materialistic, naturalistic worldviews. But that is almost verbatim, the argument that Lewis is trying to make here is that once we get to this understanding that there is some sort of, I'm trying to think of, I don't have the words here in front of me, but out of the Old Testament, with Jeremiah, where I will write my law on their hearts. That's kind of,
But there's an innate sense of morality or right and wrong or where the boundaries lie.
Yep.
Even if that's skewed, and I think that's what Paul was talking about in Romans 1, even if that starts to get warped by sin and whatnot, and just even in our own selfishness, we try to squish it and stuff it and, deny it or whatever. We have some sense of not just God's existence, but even that there's a standard.
Yes.
Yeah. So that kind of leads us into chapter 2. This chapter where Lewis is saying, he calls it Some Objections. And quoting Lewis here, he says, "The moment that you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are, in fact, measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more than the other." So once you start to compare my morality to your morality and say, well, or that one over there is not very good, that you're admitting that there's a standard here. Now, what do you think he's doing in this? I like how you said that earlier, almost like a chess move here. What's the next chess move?
Well, ultimately, that first step is, and we've kind of flirted around it a little bit here as we've been talking about it, is that whether we want to admit it or not, all of us make moral judgments.
Yeah.
We might have a different lens of what that looks like. We might be coming from different, but invariably, we make moral judgments. And if you have a moral standard, that means that you can deviate from that moral standard.
Right.
And if you can deviate from that moral standard, what is that deviation? Because that's ultimately where this is going to go. Your moral standard might be different than mine.
Yeah.
You might see that deviation differently. But if there is a standard that we can be held to, and then there's deviation from that standard, what is that deviation? And eventually, we're going to get to, well, this is sin, right?
Yeah, right.
And so he's really slow walking people, and that's, I think he'll go on later, be like, this isn't a trick,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
but he's trying to walk people into a position of, no matter what your standard of morality is, there is one. If I differ from yours, you clearly have seen me as deviating from the standard.
Right. Yeah, the minute you judge me, yeah.
And then now, what is that piece? And, like I say, ultimately that's going to be a discussion on sin. But that's where we're going to, he's going to try and get them kind of into that next position to be ready for
them ready for that.
For what follows.
Yeah, right. Well, and that's exactly right. I think you used the word slow. I mean, he's slow. He's moving very slow and very incremental steps. And in fact, he admits this. Kind of fast forwarding a little bit into chapter 4, he says, "Do not think I'm going faster than I really am. I'm not yet within 100 miles of the God of Christian theology." He's saying, look, I'm not starting with, the Bible says, therefore you should behave this way. Now, does he believe that? Absolutely. He's not even close to that, is what he's saying. So, but why do you think he's taking his sweet time rather than just jumping right into the argument for the existence of God as revealed in the Bible?
Because I think he knows how hard it is. We've talked about his background a little bit.
Yeah.
And how it was similar to, my background a little bit. It can be difficult to go, here again, if you're talking to someone who is a atheist, a naturalistic, humanistic atheist, if you just come and say, hey, because the Bible says so.
The 10 Commandments tell you to do this.
That person's not even going to listen to you.
Right.
And having gone through this process himself of doing that research and that study and coming to the conclusion that the Christian faith is the faith that has always been, and is the one. So I think he really understands personally some of the objections that people make, some of the stumbling blocks that they have, some of the places where they're going to just instantaneously kind of throw up and go, nah, I'm no longer interested in listening to, I've heard every other street preacher and I've got no interest in this.
Right.
But if we can slow walk you and get you from the curb, we talked about the house before. Yeah. If we can get you from the curb on the sidewalk, from the sidewalk to the steps, and then knock on that door, perhaps we can, make this case as we go along.
Yeah, yeah. And, back to what we were talking about earlier about how apologetics isn't evangelism. They're not the same thing. And that, what we're talking about even right now here is, we this might be how we evangelize, a method of evangelism. But I think it's also important here, and I think Lewis would agree, you're never going to just reason somebody into the kingdom. But these are things that God uses to help prepare that person for when they hear the gospel. Yeah.
Well, and I like, for me too, that's been kind of a hard one for me over the years since my conversion and acceptance of faith in Christ, is that once you get into some of this, and like you've said, I enjoy apologetics and I enjoy philosophy, and I think I can make a really good argument for the existence of God from contingency, which is probably one of my favorites. And that when I'm done with this, there's no way you can look at me and go, sorry, I don't believe you. Because I'm going to take you premise, conclusion, and you're going to be in. That has not been the experience that any of us experience in that area. And ultimately learning that difference too of, it's not me who ultimately is converting hearts. That's the space for the Holy Spirit to do. I'm hopefully just turning the light on the porch so that maybe they're ready to come off the street. Boy, this is probably a conversation for another time, but I think about, and I know you and I have talked about how much we appreciate the ministry of William Lane Craig. And in the times that I've even got to hear him speak live or debate live, what impresses me about him sometimes is, yes, he'll lay out these 6-point arguments for the existence of God, whatever it is, whatever tactic he's using that day. But inevitably, I've heard him say this many times, he'll say something like, now there's one more reason, and it's what God's done in my life. And he admits, and he says, I can't, all I'm saying is I believe God has done something in my life. And I can't prove it. I can't reason you into that. But I'm testifying that God has done something amazing in my life. And I always think that that's interesting. And you're right, for the kind of the somebody that's just not convinced, that might not be a convincing argument. But I think it does show this at the end of the day. It's God who changes hearts. But I think God uses these things. And so when we then kind of get to the end, the last chapter of book 1 here, Lewis is becoming a little more, he's starting to creep into Christianity just a little bit. He starts to hint that he's going to work toward an argument for Christianity. And what he says is, the reason I'm doing all this is Christianity is not going to make sense to you unless I first help you to understand the problem that it claims to address. He says it this way. He says, when you know you are sick, you will listen to the doctor. All I'm doing is to ask people to face the facts, to understand the questions which Christianity claims to answer. I thought that was great. So that got highlighted and underlined in my copy. But what do you think about where Lewis sort of leaves things at the end of that chapter, at the end of book 1 here? Well, and that's the culmination of what we've again kind of been talking about, is that he's not going to use the word sin,
right?
But he's going to illustrate it through sickness, and if you are sick and you can recognize that you are sick, now maybe you'll be open to listening to the doctor that you just articulated there. And so he's still using kind of symbolic language, and as he's narrating his way through here. But that's definitely what he's doing. This is now where we're going to go from just, we've all agreed there's objective morality.
Yeah.
We've come to the conclusion that you and I can disagree about where that standard is and that deviation exists.
Yeah.
And now that we know that there's this deviation there caused by sickness, now we can get to the prescription for that's going to make that sickness better.
Right. And he says so much more in this that we've not really even kind of talked about. That he's hinting a little bit at that the source of this standard seems to be pointing toward a being. In fact, he seems to be suggesting it's not just a thing, a being, a power, but it's a person. It's something like us, and he hasn't got that far yet.
Nope.
He's just sort of pointing and saying, "I'm getting you closer to this."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Boy, and there's so much else we could dig out of this. Anything else, Adam, that you just kind of in your reading of this first part of the book that stood out to you, your takeaway, or have we mined the depths, do you think, of this part so far?
Well, we definitely haven't gotten anywhere to mining the depths of it. Like you said, there's so much of it that you can go back and reread and reread and reread, and it's why all these years later it still has great value for people who are already Christians and people who might not yet be Christians. So we definitely haven't mined the depths of it. I think for me, I just appreciated, when you texted me about possibly doing this. Yeah. And so, it was a book that I read, what is that now? 14, 15 years ago.
Do the math here.
Yeah, 14, 15 years ago-ish. And hadn't come back to since, and have moved into, some of the more areas of Christian philosophy and Christian apologetics. Yeah. To come back to something like this in and of itself, the takeaway was just, it was kind of inspiring to me how basic or simple or straightforward this conversation is, and still is effectively pulling you along on this journey to get you to be open to whatever those next steps that he's making. And like I say, it just the literary skill that he has, and that I think he pulls even from being a novelist of, we're setting a scene, we're setting our situation, here are the players and the characters in this, you and me and your neighbor, and then building that story out in a way that eventually we'll get to that climax of the story. But it's just done extremely artfully.
Yeah, very thoughtful. There's a real simplicity to it, and yet there's a real depth to it. It's meaty, and but just to the title, it's that mere Christianity. He's not overcomplicating it. But these are very profound things. These are deep. And, what we know from this side of things is these are things that matter for eternity. And we better get this right. And he understands that this is not just some philosophical exercise, that this is our eternity is at stake here. Depending on what we conclude, whether we sort of agree with not just agree with Lewis, but agree with the gospel, or we reject the gospel. So, so much more that we could say here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what other folks think about this. And hopefully this is a blessing to our church here. So, but Adam, before we wrap up here, I want to do one more thing. I want to ask you this question that I ask everyone at the end of the podcast episodes. And so, we talk about becoming deeply devoted followers of Jesus together. I'd like to ask you, Adam, what's one thing that you have been blessed by lately that is deepening your devotion to Jesus?
Well, I've got a couple, actually. One might be a little bit too on the nose here, but honestly, getting the text and the opportunity to do this, it brought me back, like I say, to a text that was kind of foundational in my early journey. And so having the ability to return to something and look at that with this perspective from, years that have gone by, and in July, having been in this church for 13 years, of that time, or 12 years. Sorry, 12 years of that time, and it's just been really. I think I said, I sat down and the first time I just read it cover to cover, because I just wanted to take it in its entirety and let it speak to me that way.
Yeah.
And then I did like you did. I went back and, reread particular passages or try to highlight on some things to be able to talk about, when we're discussing it a little bit more in depth. And I mean, that's just been a real gratifying process for me to kind of go back to some of those original roots. Beyond that, we've talked about it. I'm always listening to something or doing something. And currently, not an advertisement for them, but the Daily Wire, Jordan Peterson has a roundtable group that they're doing a discussion on the Gospels currently, called the Gospel Seminar. Started out a little slow for me, but it's picked up as it's gone along. Definitely doesn't cover all the things you would necessarily want out of that. But there's a couple individuals involved in that panel, which again, for me, the diving into story and structure and patterns of reality, that's been really edifying for me in my understanding of like some of the Sermon on the Mount and some of the parables in the Gospel of Matthew, which has been real good for me. And then the last thing that I'm doing, surprisingly enough, and just like I say, to encourage people to kind of go all over, whether that's philosophy or theology or there's a Canadian cognitive scientist. His name is John Vervaeke, and he has a YouTube channel. And on his YouTube channel, he has a series that he's going through called After Socrates. And he's not currently a Christian believer. He grew up in a Christian family. He's kind of fallen away from the faith, but he's grappling with the same thing that we've kind of, this meaning crisis that exists, and how cognitive science and our attention and what we give our attention to and how that can shape and direct our thought. Again, being kind of personal and vulnerable with this, with some of the life group stuff, I'm very comfortable in the heady.
Yeah.
I sometimes struggle in my prayer life or the spiritual aspect of Christianity. I find those waters more scary and more uncomfortable and more difficult. And so what is it that we focus our attention on? What is prayer fundamentally? How can prayer shape our minds in a way that shapes our, actions? And so that one has been, while not necessarily strictly, a Christian podcast, has been big for me on trying to maybe focus in on prayer more. Okay. So those have been kind of where I've been at here as of late.
Good. Well, thanks for the subtle plug for life groups. I'll echo that. I didn't pay Adam to say that, but always trying to encourage folks to get into life groups. And it really is good. I've enjoyed the groups that we've been in just because there's been a diversity of people who come at these things from all kinds of angles, and we learn from one another, and we're challenged by one another, and we disagree with one another, and it's been good. So Adam, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks for helping us get started with Mere Christianity. Again, folks, what we're going to do is we're going to give people time to read. And so the next episode of the read along is not going to happen for about a month, and so you've got time to read or reread, and we'll get back into it. In that meantime, I'd love to hear from folks about what you thought was helpful about this episode, or what did we leave out, what should we have said more of or less of, and really want to make this something that blesses our church family. But that's going to do it then for this episode of the Deeply Devoted podcast, and we will be back next Tuesday with another episode. Until then, have a great week, and thanks for listening.